Hi, guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I'm here to discuss some crucial steps that led to the Civil War. So, you've already heard about events like the Compromise of 1850, but I'm actually going to speak to you guys about some written works as well as a very important Supreme Court case, Dred Scott versus Sanford, that led to the fraction within our country and inevitably to the Civil War. So I'm actually going to start back in 1852 with the publication of a book by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, you guys may have heard the phrase that the pen is mightier than the sword. And that does definitely hold true with Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel released in 1852, and it's the story of a slave named Uncle Tom who lived under a very brutal owner named Simon Legree. And the goal of Harriet Beecher Stowe was to educate Northerners about the horrors of slavery and hopefully make Southerners a little more sympathetic to the plight of slaves. And in the first year alone, Uncle Tom's Cabin sold over 300,000 copies. What's interesting about Harriet Beecher Stowe and her motivation for writing the book is that she grew up in a very strict religious and abolitionist household. And she was living in Cincinnati, Ohio, and across the river saw Kentucky and saw slaves being auctioned and mothers being torn apart from their children. Well, she unfortunately lost her son Sam to illness at a young age as well. So she felt like she could relate to mothers being torn from their children. And that was one of the many motivations that she had with writing the book. Many Southern books were published in response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. You see here Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, or The Cabin and Parlor, or Slaves and Masters. So those were meant as kind of almost rebuttals to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Another important piece of literature is Sociology for the South by George Fitzhugh. And this was published in 1854, and this is quite different than Uncle Tom's Cabin. But he essentially argued that slavery gave slaves protection and an economic security that not many men had in a capitalist society. He actually believed that the North was very corrupt, and that capitalism was something that caused multiple social divides within our society. So he really said that slavery kind of protected the economic interests of slaves. It's a very kind of sophisticated system, and that it protects what he deemed to be an inferior race, and that it gave them something to strive for. And whenever you see an argument like this, like the institution of slavery protecting slaves, that is often referred to as paternalism, kind of this institution looking out for the best interests of slaves. So this was a widely popular piece that was published during this time as well. On a different note, I also want to discuss a Supreme Court case that was years and years in the making, and that's Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. So Dred Scott was a slave. He was born in Virginia and spent some time elsewhere before he was sold to a military doctor. He lived in St. Louis, Missouri. And then during his time with his owner, traveled with that military doctor to various military forts in both Illinois and Wisconsin. Now, under the Missouri Compromise, Illinois and Wisconsin were deemed free territories. And so Dred Scott, over the years, was hired out to other slave owners, but believed that he potentially had a case to argue for his freedom, which he had tried to purchase multiple times before, on the fact that he had lived in a free territory for a period of time. He actually did win in the lower courts, but the case was appealed and made its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is Judge Roger Taney who wrote the opinion, arguing that as a slave, Dred Scott had no business suing in a court of law. And so as a result, because he wasn't a slave and wasn't technically a citizen, that this lawsuit was null and void. This is a huge victory for the South when the highest law in the land is essentially sending the message that slaves can't even bring about a lawsuit in front of the courts. And so this, like I said, was seen as a huge victory for the South. So those are a couple of things, guys, that I wanted to mention. Obviously, the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin did open the eyes of many Northerners and made Southerners a little defensive about the institution of slavery. George Fitzhugh tries to combat that by defending the institution of slavery. And then, so that continues again for the country to become more and more divided. And then with the Dred Scott versus Sandford decision, again, just the fact that slaves are not viewed as human beings is a victory for the South, and of course continues to further the divide within the United States. And as you can see, we are just a few years out from the actual Civil War. So I hope that helped you guys, and I hope you have a great day.